I grew up in a very traditional, church-going family here in Ontario. My dad was the vice president of some software company while Mom stayed at home and raised us. We were able to afford that kind of lifestyle because my dad had made a ton of money in the dot-com boom and continued to make six figures in his VP position. Mom was a capable woman and probably could have done pretty well for herself professionally, but our privilege gave her the opportunity to raise us the old-fashioned way. She cooked, she cleaned, but most importantly, she dedicated her time to making sure that my little sister and I wanted for nothing. I always knew that we were lucky. Other kids would tell us so. She was an amazing cook, fun to hang out with, just about as wholesome a woman as you were to ever likely meet. But my dad, on the other hand, was something of a button-down psycho. I don't want to go into what happened to prompt their divorce, but let's just say that it involved a lengthy prison sentence, and a bunch of reporters camped outside her house for like a week and a half. My dad turned out to be a terrible person, that's kind of putting it lightly, and discovering that was harder on us than I could ever put into words. I was stunned. My sister was heartbroken, but as much as Mom felt it too, she was our rock during that period. I honestly don't know what we'd have done without her. She did everything she could to shield us from it too, but we knew that she was hurting. She just didn't want to show it. She got so much money in the divorce settlement that she never had to work again, so apart from downsizing our house, life pretty much went on as normal. The pain and anger was still there. They just got quieter and quieter each year until we all just got used to the fact that Dad was never coming home and that he'd never really been home in the first place. About 6 or 7 years go by. I'm approaching 30 while my little sister's in her late teens. I'm moved out, living and working on the other side of town while my sister is still living at home with Mom. She was taking a year out of school, just taking time to decide what she wanted to study, maybe working part-time somewhere, but mostly just hanging out. One day I'm swapping texts with my mom when she mentions how she and my little sister had been bickering a lot. I asked what about, and she told me that it mostly stemmed from a disagreement about moving out. Mom had downsized into a much smaller house to keep her costs down, a one-bedroom, one-bathroom bungalow that was cozy for one, but pretty cramped for two. She thought my sister should find a place of her own. My sister disagreed, and catty comments ensued, etc., etc. Nothing entirely out of the ordinary for a grown mother and daughter, but my little sister didn't quite see things that way. According to her, our mom had made some real vicious remarks to her, things that were entirely out of character. I asked her to specify, and she said that Mom had cursed at her. In all my years of knowing her, I had never, ever known Mom to curse out of shoot or dang it, so to hear that she'd used something harsher was definitely kind of a shock. But then again, both me and my sister were basically grown by that point, and by their own admission, they had been arguing a lot. Maybe she'd always cursed like that in front of other adults, but we just never witnessed it. Now, a few more weeks go by and I didn't hear anything else about so-called vicious comments, so I assumed it was just a one-off and forgot about it. I also assumed that a big mitigating factor in any tension between my mom and sister had been the fact that my sister had gotten herself a job. She was working in a restaurant with one of her friends, and from the sounds of it, she was enjoying it and making a respectable amount of money. She'd also very quickly gone from part-time to full-time hours, meaning Mom was home alone more and more. Mom often had friends and relatives over, both for visits and to stay overnight. So as much as she had the house to herself, she wasn't alone all the time. This meant that we didn't have to worry about her, or at least, it meant that I didn't have to worry about her so much as I used to. But then came the phone call that turned my whole world upside down, and it came on one of the most beautiful days of the year. It was sometime in late June, and the weather outside was simply gorgeous, so me and my girlfriend at the time decided to go for a walk through this nature reserve just outside of town. We're just walking along, holding hands, wholesome as can be, when my mom starts going off in my pocket. The caller ID said private number, which my girlfriend dismissed as being spam or something. Any other time, I'd have just hit the red button and just declined the call, and I don't even know how to put the sensation into words, but something in my gut told me that I needed to answer. It turned out to be the cops. Mom had been arrested, for breaking one of her friend's arms. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, I literally couldn't. I asked for the cop's ID number, asked where he was calling from, and just in this complete state of denial. The cop was really understanding, and looking back on it was stunningly patient considering I basically accused him of trying to prank me. He remained patient when I assured him that there must have been some kind of mistake and that my mother was incapable of doing something like that, especially to one of her own friends. But then the officer reeled off my mom's name, her address, a bunch of other stuff, and then gave me a perfect description of her too. It's only then that I realized that he was serious, that what was happening was real, and suddenly, I needed to sit down. Once I gathered my thoughts a little, I asked the officer what I could do to bail her out or get her some legal counsel, and it's at that point that I realized why the cop had been so patient with me to begin with. There was no bailing Mom out, no getting her legal counsel for the time being. She was being admitted to a secure psychiatric facility for involuntary treatment under the laws laid out in Canada's Mental Health Act, I found out later. What they were telling me is that my mom had suffered a complete nervous breakdown. But not just any old nervous breakdown. Hers was characterized by some extreme aggression and violence. And that's when the head swimming, can't think sort of feeling returned. The words aggressive and violent and my mom, they just weren't computing for me. I couldn't even picture what it might look like. All I could do was ask for, where do we go from here? And I was told that a member of Mom's care team would be in touch and that I'd be able to talk to her and visit soon as possible. After the call ended, I immediately got in touch with my little sister to let her know what had happened. She was just as stunned as I was, but if you remember, she'd also noticed the little crack starting to form, so to her, it was less of a total system shock. I asked if she knew which friend it was whose arm she had broken. She didn't, but she said that she'd get to work figuring out who. My sister was closer with my mom's friends back then, so I'm very grateful that she was there to deal with that side of things. I don't know what I'd have done without her. We had to wait a week to be able to talk to her. The state confiscated her cell phone and gave her some prepaid burner thing that she could use to contact us. I almost missed the call from not really knowing when it would come, but when it did, she actually sounded kind of normal. At first, anyway. When I realized it was her, I tried to ask how she was, if she needed anything. All the stuff that I'd been waiting to ask her for like a week by that point. She didn't want to know. Instead, she very calmly told me the name and badge number of the police officer who had put her in cuffs, and she then told me to find that officer and spit in his face for disrespecting my mother the way he did. When she hit the word spit, she went from her calm speaking voice to a screech so loud it hurt my ear. I guess it goes without saying at this point, but I'd never heard her sound like that in all the years that I'd known her. And then for her to ask me to spit in a cop's face, it was like she'd transformed into a completely different person overnight, and it absolutely terrified me. I didn't know who she'd hurt, if she was going to jail or some sort of institution. I didn't know if she'd ever be back to her old self again. But before Mom was calm enough to visit, we got to the bottom of the legal issues that she was facing, which surprisingly were very little. If it wasn't for the obvious mental health crisis that was occurring, Mom would have been charged with aggravated assault and assaulting a police officer. As it turned out, she both punched and bit. You read that right. The cop that was trying to arrest her. Again, I was just in total shock hearing that she'd attacked a police officer, but the good news was they weren't going to charge her. The officer I spoke to said that there wasn't a jury in the country that wouldn't return a not guilty by temporary insanity verdict. They knew my mom was acting extremely out of the ordinary, and they weren't about to make the situation worse by throwing formal charges on top. Not long after, we were permitted to visit for the first time. Me and my little sister showed up to the hospital, more nervous and anxious than we'd ever been in our entire lives. I tried to be the best big brother that I could be and stay strong for her, but the reality was more like the other way around. Let's just say Mom wasn't ready for a visit. The hospital staff believed that she was, but seeing her children really set her off. Some people might think it's overly dramatic of me to describe Mom's transformation as being like that of a werewolf. But in my heart of hearts, that's exactly what it felt like. Before our eyes, she went from being the sweet, wholesome mom we'd always known, and she transformed into that terrifying creature that I'd only heard on the phone up until that point. When she learned that I'd tracked down the officer who'd quote-unquote disrespected her, read as the one she bit, she got so angry with me that my sister called in the orderlies to restrain her. That moment, seeing the woman who'd raised me being ready to claw my eyes out, all because of some chemical imbalance in her brain, I guess, that was just some true terror for me. I left feeling catatonic. My mom was dead, but her heart was still beating. The woman that had raised me was gone and she was never coming back. But that's what I believed at my very lowest point, and it's a feeling that other people are going to feel at some point if they're lucky enough to have a friend or loved one go through a mental health crisis, that is. There is a way back. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. You just need to stay strong. Through medication, therapy, and a lot of patience, Mom got back to normal. I won't lie, it was a slow process and it was emotionally exhausting in the extreme, but we found a little bit of light in the darkness and we clung to it. Mom is better now, much better. Like you'd never have guessed that she went through this sort of crisis from just looking at her. But I guess that's what's so scary about mental illness in the first place. It could strike anyone, no matter how stable and secure they seem. A person can only take so much stress, and when they break, it can be scarier than any ghost story. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.